Welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast, hosted by divorce financial analyst and retirement planning counselor Andrew Hatherley. Join Andrew and guest experts as they help late life divorcees build the financial and mental foundation for a meaningful future. There is life after divorce. Now, on to the show.
Hello, everybody. My guest today is Hirsch Serman. As a certified divorce financial analyst, a certified public accountant, and trained mediator, Hirsch is uniquely qualified to recognize and creatively work through often overlooked financial complexities, tax issues, and inequities in the divorce settlement process. His value-based approach is to prioritize, organize, simplify your financial life during and beyond the divorce process. Hirsch and I are both members of the Amicable Divorce Network. Hirsch is part of the Illinois chapter, and Hirsch and I have both written chapters for the book Divorce Amicably: Your Roadmap to Resolution. In fact, don't know if you know this, Hirsch, but our chapters are side by side. You're number 48, and I'm number
I did notice that, yes.
48 and 49 in the book. We share a few other things in common, which may come out over the course of this conversation. Hirsch, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too, and I know our listeners are probably picking up already on your voice, and there's an accent there, and this is one of the things we share in common. Tell us a little bit about your background. Let's start with where you're from.
I was born in South Africa and I came on a one-year scholarship when I was 17. And it's been a very long year. I'm still here. So it's been about 38 years, 39 years now.
Oh my goodness. I don't think I've ever told the listeners of the Great Divorce podcast that I was actually born in England, but my father was a naval well, a sailor, and I ended
Mhm.
up growing up in Canada. So we're is South Africa still a member of the British Commonwealth, is it not?
It is. It is.
All right. Enough of the British Commonwealth. Hirsch, how did you get into the role of divorce financial coach?
It's so interesting, how life leads you in ways. I've been a CPA 25 years, thought that's what I was going to do for my life. Um, I ended up going through three major life cycles in like 2022 months. One of them was my divorce. That was started in 2013. All support groups and people were like, I need help with, financial affidavit, a budget, whatever it was. And I was like, well, I can help you. I can help you. So unofficially, I really started back in about 13, officially 2015. I love what I do, though. I think it's incredibly rewarding. I don't manage money. I don't do business valuations. I do want to throw that out. Often people throw that in, but I like, as you said, a values-based approach to understand who you are, create a strategy. I have a tax practice, some forensic work, help people understand their options and really understand who they are financially, which becomes a very important piece of it all as well.
So when somebody comes to you and they're going through divorce, first of all, what's the first thing that you'd recommend to them? And then let's get into how you specifically might help because, I see you're a CPA, so obviously you have the tax-based knowledge there, CDFA, the financial, mediation work. But when someone comes to you, what's the first piece of advice you give them when they're facing divorce?
The first thing I tell them is do nothing.
Interesting.
Sometimes you're so tempted, especially if you're the one that is being served. I've had clients, I'm sure you have as well, that have been somewhat blindsided, or I knew things were bad, but I didn't think that bad. Or on the other side, maybe you've been slighted. Maybe there was some infidelity or complete mismanagement of the finances or whatever it might be. Sometimes there's that temptation, like, I'm going to show, the spouse, I'm going to get my pound of flesh, whatever it might be. So put that aside. That's not a good way to go. I think the first thing really to do though is kind of step back and just kind of process what's happening. kind of understand what you know about your financial life as a married couple, as a family. But then I think you need to start building your team. If you're not very well versed in finances, uh, you should be looking at a CDFA, that's Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. You should be getting, whether it's mental health professional, the legal, but build a team. You want a team, not individuals, I think. And then really start to understand. Part of this process should also be not just what's happening now through the divorce, but really focusing beyond the divorce, trying to understand what my life's going to look like beyond it, whether it's from an emotional and mental health perspective, whether it's a financial position. But those are the first kind of few steps I would say that are really needed when it comes to looking at what's going to happen going forward.
There's some very important things that I want to pick up on what you said. First of all, the idea of do nothing. And I look back on my own divorce, and it all became very frenetic because my ex hired an attorney. So I felt immediately needed to go out and hire an attorney. And when you're doing anything in a rush, whether it's whatever, uh, ultimately it's perhaps not going to be the best way to approach things. Anything from a level head is done better than on the fly. But
I
sometimes it's
think that's
difficult.
so cool. Yeah, no, it can be. A perfect example is, you want your professionals to align with your thought process or your direction. The classic example is hiring the wrong attorney, and that can be very expensive, especially if you're putting down, seven or $10,000 retainer sometimes. And you just and do it amicably, but because you had that knee-jerk reaction, you got, a shock or that litigator and you hired the wrong guy or lady, right? These are some of the things, some of the mistakes I think that sometimes people make that can just raise those bills that we all want to avoid.
So true. And the old cliche in the legal world is that the criminal justice system may see bad people on their best behavior, but the divorce world sees good people or normal
Yeah,
people on their worst behavior. And
right.
the type of attorney you get and the process that you follow, if it's going to be a litigious, conflictive process, well, that's not going to bring out the best in anybody. So
Correct.
the idea, and this brings me to the next point you mentioned about a team. Um, Being members of the Amicable Divorce Network, as we both are, there are a myriad of different types of divorce professionals in the network, all vetted and committed to a settlement-minded
Right.
approach. Now, of course, throw out the disclaimer: in some cases, you're going to need a litigious attorney if there's major um, issues, abuse, financial malfeasance. But I think in most cases, a settlement minded attorney is the way to go. And we all have access to attorneys. Of course, we're both in the financial realm, but therapists, real estate professionals who are all settlement minded, which can just help people put the right minded team together.
Yeah, it's a great network. I've been very impressed with the people, the way that it's run. We kind of live halfway across the country from each other, but we can still collaborate on whether it's this or other ideas. That's the part that I love about when you find the right person. Sometimes you're not the right professional, but I can turn around and say, you know what? Andrew's a better fit for you. That's the right person for your financial needs. I think being able to tap into a network like the Amicable Divorce Network and who our contacts are becomes very powerful for a client being able to go through that divorce.
Agreed. And of course, I can almost hear listeners out there saying, "Well, that's expensive." And of course, when you think about it, attorneys usually charge anywhere from 400 to 600, $700 an hour. I don't, and
Yeah,
most you probably don't, and
I
certainly
wish
most.
I could.
But of course, perhaps you could speak to that issue.
You know, I think you're hitting on a couple things there that are so important. Number one is, people go and they use their attorney, and look, it's not the attorney's fault always because the client sometimes goes to them with it. But you're asking, so to speak, an unqualified person to be your mental health counselor or to do your tax review or your financial work, right? I'm not a legal expert. Don't come to me with your legal stuff. I want you to use your attorney. I want to do your finance. But having us speak to each other and be on the same page so everybody really understands what's going on becomes a very important piece to your lawyer being able to advocate for you in mediation or wherever it is that it might be. So that's why I say building a team where they actually can speak to each other often. So it sounds counterintuitive, like you said, you're adding professionals to the mix, but you're probably going to get a better outcome for cheaper by doing it that way because, as we said, we're not charging the rates that attorneys are, and you actually getting the expert in finance when you get a CDFA. That's
Yeah, yeah,
not a
no,
knock on the legal profession.
no,
That's
no, no,
their
no, no,
training and
no,
our training.
no knock at all. And I often joke that, because when I was going through my divorce, you go into the attorney's conference room, and every attorney's conference room in the family law world has a box of tissues on the conference table, and the attorney's going to tell you, don't pay me $500 an hour to be your therapist. I've got a network of people who will really help you with your emotional balance and emotional regulation through the process, which ultimately I know and as a financial professional will work to the client's best interest because you don't want to be making decisions in a highly charged emotional state.
100%.
Yeah. So, Hirsch, I mentioned at the outset that you do a values-based approach to divorce. And this is curious to me. What do you mean by a values-based approach? What does that mean?
I think often, I mean, I was married for 20 years. I had to, in many ways, rediscover who I was, right? Because I was a father, I was a husband, but I wasn't kind of like an individual anymore, right? I was in the family. So sometimes really rediscovering who you are. My first blog I ever wrote was picked up in, I think, early 15, maybe 14. And I originally called it Divorce is Awesome, right? And everyone's like, you can't do that. That's like a horrible name. And I wish I had kept the name. I didn't. But the gist of it really was like you got to learn who you are, what brings you joy, what are the things that are important to you because you've often compromised. So the first thing is really getting back to understanding. I've got an exercise I do with people where I run through what are the things that are really important to them. And it covers financial, it covers emotional, it covers kids, all different things. And then I ask them, hey, pretend you the spouse and do the same thing. Now we're getting a bit of the dynamic of what the negotiation will look like. But if you know what your maybe top 3 to 5 values and priority guiding light, you really know when you're negotiating and those things that you're talking about, because it's easy to get lost in the clutter, right? There's a lot of things going on. But if you're discussing things and you go, you know what, that doesn't go in with my values and priorities. You don't need to spend the time, the effort, or the argument and giving up the goodwill on the things that don't really matter for you, or you can use them to get more of what you want. So that's piece number one is really being able to understand that. And then I do it with a budget where I do budgets a little bit differently. I basically, what is your bottom line that you can't go below? What is your fully loaded life? You're probably going to come somewhere in between, but you marry the two together. What are my values? What are my priorities? How do I want to live my life financially? And you put them together, you've kind of got the framework of a strategy that's based on your priorities and your values. And again, using that as your guiding light, that's not a problem now in many ways of do I want this, do I not? Because you already know what's important to you. And it's okay if those values change, right? Often it's like, I want the house. And then maybe later on, it's like, I don't know that I can afford the house, or it's too big, or whatever the reason is, right? It's okay to change them somewhat. I wouldn't say every day, obviously, but it's okay that they do change. But again, regrouping and having your kind of, northern star of where am I going, what am I working towards, helps you get there so much better than kind of going in blind.
When you talked about the house, and I don't mean to stereotype, but often, particularly in younger divorcees, that the wife may want the house because there's children and they want to keep the house till the kids are seen through high school. Less an issue of the listeners to this podcast who are typically don't have children in the house. But I'll tell you one issue of interest to listeners to this podcast are men and their retirement plans. Lord of the Rings and my precious. Well, I've often joked that a man's retirement plan is his precious. And I'm wondering, are you talking about values as to like commitments and lines in the sand, or because how can you get someone to move away from that? Or am I misunderstanding you?
No, so the values are really your priorities, what's important, what is your core value, so to speak, but it obviously comes with a price tag and you've got to evaluate that. So, for somebody who absolutely wants the home, you've got to really ultimately say, financially, is this the right decision? Because it might change your view a little bit. So maybe the classic is, I want to stay there till little Johnny's, graduated high school. I want there to be consistency. And those are all very important priorities and values to have. But if you look at it and say, but I'm now going to become a slave financially to the home, and then I can't be as good a parent, or it's really not going to have the same, steadiness and continuity for the kids. Well, now that might change your priorities on that home, right? Um, maybe it's in a declining neighborhood. I'm just, making that up on the spot. But when you do a deeper dive into that, and I'm sure you have as well, there are times you can discuss the home for an hour sometimes. What are the alternatives? What are the tax impacts? What if we, sell it now versus 3 years from now? What will the capital gains be? There's so many components to it. But the idea really is sometimes what we think about the house versus when we do a deep dive and really evaluate how does that play into the larger picture, it might not seem quite as important as it did initially. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does, because I'm thinking the bigger picture. Typically, we're emerging from divorce with half the net worth that we went in as a household.
Correct.
And you've talked about budgeting, and I did an article in Kiplinger's recently, and I did a podcast also on those two key financial measures in divorce, the budget and the net worth statement. So I was curious what you were saying about the budget, because Lord knows it's like pulling teeth getting somebody to work on their budget. I'm curious, from one professional to another, any tips of the trade you could offer to both myself as a professional or other people out there listening as to approaching the budgeting process, because it's so important in divorce.
It is, and I think for many people it's daunting, quite honestly. I remember I was playing a neutral role and I had a couple, and I said, well, do you guys have a budget? Which, by the way, the statistics I've seen are about 7 out of 10 families do not have a budget. So very few people in general do. And this particular couple said, oh yeah, we do. And then the one spouse looked at the other one and said, we've had a kid since we put that budget together, right? So people don't really have, that. It's such an important piece to it, though, especially if somebody, there's often a scarcity mentality. If somebody is scared about how am I going to come out financially? Another quick story, I was dealing with somebody, they were going to come out with about 1.8, 1.9 million. So not enormous money, but a lot of money. And this woman said to me, I'm going to be okay with that, right? And I looked at her, I said, I don't know. And she looked at me like, you're the finance guy. And I said, you've been living a $450,000, $500,000 lifestyle. You don't have a whole lot of years with 1.8 million, right? 4 years, let's say. Or are you going to temper that down to, I don't know, 150,000 maybe a year? 1.8 million is going to last you a whole lot longer, right? So I think it's meeting them where they are and then educating them as to why they need to understand this. You want more alimony, or what's now called maintenance. Why? Well, if you don't know how much you spend, how do you know that it's a feasible or reasonable ask?
Right.
So I think you've got to judge that a little bit on who you're working with right now. But then it becomes a little bit of an education. And then being able to make it less daunting, whether you chunk it up into pieces, however you want to make it less daunting. But I think the initial thing is I've never done this. I have no idea how I'm doing it. I'm going to avoid it. And I think you can't always avoid it. And how do you get them to understand that becomes step number one.
You talked about the essentials and so the non-discretionary items. Of course, those are two different things to different people. And some
Yes.
people, um, the kid needs to go to a $50,000 a year private school, or the cruise needs to be taken on Regent Seven Seas and not Princess.
Yes.
Um, it's some conversations and some hard, realistic discussions need to be made during the process.
Sometimes that is huge. That I mean, if I've got a client like that, my approach, again, it doesn't work with everyone, I will be honest. My analogy is what is essential? Is it that you need, for example, a gym membership? Okay, great. I'm not against you having a gym membership, but do you need Lifetime Fitness or LA Fitness? Right? I mean, there's a big price tag difference, right? I mean, one could be 10 times the other one, right? I think breaking it down to the concept, you need a cruise. Okay, I'm going to go with let's fit a cruise into your life, not necessarily need it. Now let's look at the spectrum of it all. That's a little bit, of how I try to deal with that.
Yeah,
As I said, not everybody's going to be in the same bucket as you or the same alignment as you are, but at least being able to reframe it, I'm not taking it out of your life. I'm just scaling it back for
exactly.
now.
It's
We can
funny.
fit it in later. Wonderful.
I had to chuckle because I've had that very gym membership conversation. Um, and I think it's
Me
like
too.
Lifetime Athletic, I think is the one that's $150 a month. And we've got Las Vegas Athletic Club's like $20 a month. And
Right,
believe me,
exactly.
there's not seven times the difference in services.
That treadmill doesn't change, right? So,
Now, uh, just to show you what a financial geek I am, I'm fascinated with the net worth statement from from a psychological point of view. And I wonder,
right.
do you use the net worth statement at all with your clients? And I'll tell you briefly how I do. I do from a psychological perspective. We know we've taken a big hit, when that decree is signed.
Yeah.
Um, but just keeping track, and I recommend people keep track on a quarterly basis just to show improvements. And even, of course, as you know, the assets don't have to go up, but if debt's being paid off, your net worth is still improving. The math of the equation. Do you bring net worth statement into your discussions at all in divorce, either before, during, or after?
I do, it's by default, not by design, but I work like 99% with women. Um, I've had one man in the last like 3.5 years, and his mom recommended him. So I really kind of consider that not by design. I would work with men if they come my way. I have no problem with it. I'm just saying by design and not in a sexist way. It's still, I find men are still the ones generally managing the finances. It certainly doesn't mean they're doing it well. They were
Mm.
not born with a calculator or, anything like that.
They think they
Um,
are in many cases.
they 100%, yes, they do. Um, so often I'm working with people who really need to understand who they are financially. I actually created a program called Who Am I Financially? It's got 4 components. I've dealt with people in their 70s who've never paid a bill. So I've
Mm.
got a bill paying module, I've got a debt module, budget module, and then I've got the net worth as a module. And yes, I think it's very, very important. I think it's important to understand the pieces of it, the difference between real estate versus cash and the liquidity. I mean, on a high level, maybe, but more so like when it comes to retirement, do you have Roth versus traditional? Like those kind of things are important to understand.
Yeah,
But
no.
as you said, I think emotionally and empowerment, like as you said, I don't need to be contributing a whole lot of money for the balance to go up. If I'm paying off debt and I'm seeing, motion or movement in that, that can be very empowering because if you have a lot of debt, and often you do in a divorce because it goes on credit cards or things like that, if you can see good movement on that, that alone can be a huge relief for somebody. So
Definitely.
getting them to understand their position, where they were 3 months, 6 months, 9 months ago, and that, the small pieces of what they've done in changing their actions can have huge consequences over time. One real quick little thought there. I had one person went through divorce, was earning actually very, very good money, but after alimony, all the rest, she still had about 1,600 a month, just completely discretionary, and she was funding her 401k, all that stuff. And she had four pieces or four categories of debt. She had a home, medical, credit cards, a lot of them because of the divorce, and a car. And she said, "Oh, I'll just pay 400 to each." And when we scheduled out her debt, and I said, "Well, your credit card, well, at the time was at 33%. Your medical's at zero. Your car, I think it was at 2.99." We restructured that. We cut out 13 months of payments
Yeah.
when it came to the credit cards. That's all interest. So, her balance didn't go up in her 401k much over the 9 months. But when you're putting 1,500, almost 1,500 a month extra, into your credit cards alone, 9 months later, you see a difference there, and you see
Yeah.
that interest rate starting to come down, or your portion of interest. That becomes hugely motivational, I think, for people.
I think I think those of us who are so debt averse, and I know there are plenty of listeners out there who share this, um, it really can be motivational just to get gradually knock away because when you're going through divorce, you think the worst is going to happen, and you have all sorts of cataclysmic scenarios. But once it's done and you start working on the rebuilding, and if you can just chip away at that debt. And that was an excellent example that you posed of the four different types of debt and the different costs, because different debt has different costs. And typically you start with the credit cards. Um, my next one was the car. The payment wasn't so high, but I had never had a car payment in my life until I needed to replace my car after the divorce. And
Right.
and as soon as I could pay that car off, it was paid off because, and once again, you know, it was a reasonably priced Hyundai as opposed to a Maserati. You know, it makes it so,
Exactly.
it
100%.
was paid off a lot
They say
quicker.
buy that 2 or 3 year old car, rolls off a lease. All the major depreciations happened. It's still in good shape. All the right. I mean, there's ways to look at it for sure. For
Definitely.
sure.
I wanted to ask you, I'd heard you speak once before. I'm not quite sure where it was. We had an interesting approach to what are the most expensive things to deal with in divorce? And I thought I'd like to ask you about that so you could share it with our listeners. The most expensive part of a divorce.
So I always tell people, all my clients, that emotions can easily be the most expensive part of your divorce. And I'll tell you, it was proved to me again today. Um, Literally about an hour before the podcast, I wrapped up a session with a client, and the spouse who earns the money, starting to earn money, I think gave a beyond reasonable offer. In fact, he offered to extend, as an example, his support, uh, up his support for about 2 years till she finishes her schooling, which again, very, very reasonable. Didn't have to, not under the Illinois guidelines of any kind, things like that, right? And her comment to me was, "But what about the fairness of what's happened to us?" Right? That was like almost verbatim what she said to me. And I'm talking an hour ago. Um, we get this in our mind, right? I said it earlier. I want my pound of flesh. I want a day in court. Well, you might get an hour in court, right? And
Yeah.
you're hoping that you come off well and that the judge goes your way. Emotions can be very, very expensive. And that we just got to be careful. If we know what we want, we've got those guiding lights, use our strategy, all of that. We don't need to go down all the rabbit holes that people talk about that become so expensive. You rack up the bills. Sometimes I have no doubt you've seen this as well. you are looking at a $10,000 item and you're going to spend 9,500 to try to get it, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. The emotional effort that you've taken and the toll for maybe coming out $500,000 ahead just doesn't make sense in any way.
Yeah, it's so true. And once again, this points up to the importance of having a team member who can help you with regulate your emotions in divorce, because it
100%.
can be so costly. And this idea that the day in court, the day, as you mentioned, might be an hour in court, and the moment you start going on about how awful your ex was, the judge doesn't help. That's not relevant. That's not relevant.
Exactly. Exactly. The other thing just on that I don't think people understand, often there's three, four, five judges that are dealing with family court, right? If you take the exact same case to the five, you may not get the same result out of every single one of them. They're human. They interpret the law a little bit differently. They have their biases. They have their pieces of, what are sacred cows to them. And you may not get the same. So it's not a cut and dry, I'm right, he or she is wrong. And you've got to take that into account. That's very, very important.
Yeah, very important, Hirsch. I think about the issue of spousal support. Unless your state has codes or formulas in place for spousal support, maybe at the discretion of a judge, and he may have a personal history with spousal support or biases that may not work in your favor.
100%. Exactly right.
Hirsch, I really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us here today. If any of our listeners want to find out more about your services or get in touch with you, how do they find you?
The easiest way is go to my website. It is lifecycle.financial. It's the name of the company, just lifecycle.financial is the website.
Terrific. And I'll put that in the show notes on the podcast page, transcendretirement.net, so people can find that and also get a review of the podcast. Hirsch, thank you very much.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Great Divorce Podcast. To learn more or get in contact with your host, you can visit Andrew's website at transcendretirement.net. Also, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Information provided is educational only and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Each situation is unique and should be discussed with your tax or legal advisor prior to implementation. Andrew Hatherley is not an attorney and does not provide legal advice. Information provided is financial in nature. Advisory services offered through Hatherley Capital Management, LLC. Divorce financial analysis services offered through Wiser Divorce Solutions, an affiliated company.